developing different strategies on what we think it's going to take for us actually to win socialism or to build socialism for real. And in the course of doing that, we looked at the vision of where we're trying to go in terms of socialism. We tried to assess the current system of capitalism or where it is right now. And we're trying to develop strategies, maybe more than one, on how we move forward. But one aspect of that work was in doing an assessment of the current system to kind of rethink what class actually means for us today. And that's what I want to kind of run through. And I'm gonna read some stuff, but I might need some people's help later on to read when we get to the different layers of the working class. But basically, when we look at capitalism, we call it racial monopoly capitalism, which is a unique variant, but I'm not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the class structure. But a sharp and ever-evolving assessment of how different classes and social forces relate to the system and to one another is essential in crafting a socialist strategy. Class is a key category for analyzing society because it relates to how the system extracts, produces, and distributes the materials needed for human life. A group's class position can profoundly impact their interest in changing the system, determining who's on our side, who's opposed, and who we need to bring to our side in order to win is one of our crucial tasks as strategists. While class analysis is necessary, it's also insufficient. Under racial monopoly capitalism, a wide range of factors shape people's consciousness, interests, and revolutionary potential, including race, gender, sexuality, religion, geographic region. We must assess these factors in relation to one another in order to offer a concrete and grounded assessment of society. Many left organizations have made the mistake of insisting that class alone shapes social struggle. An integrated analysis of class and social forces is key to refining the social mapping we need, especially given the current tremors in our society. The concept of class is one of the key tools that revolutionaries have used to analyze society, but there are very few class analyses of contemporary US society. That's one of the things we're trying to do here. And we're not saying this is the correct thing. That's the other thing. Like, it's just an attempt to explain the world as we see it. But there are many reasons that there aren't current assessments. First, there's no consensus about what class even means. Although it was central to his analysis, Marx did not fully define what he meant by class. So revolutionaries have had to develop their own understanding. Furthermore, the Cold War era defeat of socialist projects and organizations left many organizers and activists without sufficient training in class analysis. The fact that people in the United States most often use class to describe a person's income or their cultural preferences confuses matters further. All of this makes our task of doing a class analysis difficult. To address this challenge, we attempted to define class and to discern the class structure of US society within racial monopoly capitalism. We define class as a group of people connected to each other by a common relationship to the society's process of exploitation. We therefore distinguish different classes from one another by their distinct relationships to the process of exploitation. Our definition of class updates the Marxist theory of class. Although Marx himself never offered a concise definition of class, most in the Marxist tradition define class as a group's relationship to the ownership and control of raw materials, tools, and workplaces that make up the means of production. This classical definition was more accurate when most people worked in factories, making commodities, using machines, and physical labor. Now manufacturing is declining and most people don't work in factories. Service, technology, finance sectors are expanding. Many people work in non-physical production jobs, including finance, sales, healthcare, and so on. Many people work from home or in other non-traditional workplaces and or are precariously unemployed, ranging from temp workers to contract workers in the emerging gig economy. Ownership and control of capitalist enterprises is also much more attenuated and internationalized now than it was in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Our updated definition of class focuses not only on who owns and controls, but on how value is extracted from workers. This includes the extraction of surplus value on the job, roughly the difference between the value of what a worker produces for the capitalist and the lower amount that she receives as wages. It also includes other forms of exploitation like predatory lending, the repossession of land and foreclosed property, or the use of unpaid prison labor. This definition allows us to better account for the ways in which capitalism extracts value by dispossession and expropriation, particularly from women and non-white workers. For example, it allows us to better account for social reproductive labor, like unpaid childcare and housework. Our assessment is that racial monopoly capitalism has given rise to a distinct class structure in the United States: the capitalist class, the professional managerial class, the small-scale capitalist class, and the working class. The capitalist class includes the executives, board members, and major shareholders who own and control the corporations and other major capitalist institutions that shape the exploitation process in the United States and around the globe. The dominant layer within this class, this capitalist class, is the monopoly capitalist layer. Those who own and control multinational corporations and whose power is becoming more concentrated. This is best exemplified by the emergence of the, quote, too big to fail, unquote, banks over the past several decades. In the 1980s, the 5 largest banks in the United States controlled 29% of banking assets, or 14% of the country's GDP, gross domestic product. By 2012, it went from 14% to 86% of GDP, reflecting their monopoly character. Similar concentration is taking place across the economy, resulting in a smaller number of wealthy people amassing ever greater power. The Koch brothers, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Jamie Dimon, Jeff Bezos are all members of this class. They operate globally, even though they're rooted and invested in the United States, often viewing this as the best option to ensure their continued market dominance. The monopoly capitalist layer serves to advance the interests of the capitalist class as a whole. It includes a dynamic cohort of socio-political elites with general ideological affinity regarding the economy. The subordinate layer of the capitalist class is the non-monopoly capitalist layer. Their actions tend to be driven more by the sectoral interests of their corporations. The next class we identify as the professional managerial class. They control the day-to-day operations of the high-level mechanisms of racial monopoly capitalism. They exert a tremendous amount of control and influence over it. This class includes managerial, financial, marketing, media, state professionals. They control the labor process. They expand our propensity to consume things. They manage a growing financial sector. They manage public opinion through the media, and they provide public spending supports to corporations, but also they provide relief to the general population, which is also a way of subsidizing capitalism. There's 2 layers in that professional managerial class. The operative layer, that's more like the big politicians. Many of them, once they're vetted, they really become a part, or they're not part of the capitalist class, but they work for them and they help to carry out the capitalist project. And then there's an executive layer, and these are mainly white collar workers like financial advisors, analysts, advertising executives, corporate managers, consultants. Members of that layer mostly own their homes, or they can afford to rent wherever they want. They often live in affluent suburban communities and utilize private services as often, or not, if not more, than they use public services. These individuals are materially wealthy. They don't rely on debt for sustenance. Similar to members of the operative layer, the members of the executive layer accept and help propagate the norms and values of the capitalist class. Together, the capitalist class and the professional managerial class comprise the exploiting classes of racial monopoly capitalism, and they represent the core opposition to our work for socialist liberation. Small-scale capitalists have a high degree of control or ownership over small aspects of the process of exploitation. Compared to other countries, This class, often referred to as the petty bourgeoisie, is relatively large in the United States and varied, though it's smaller than the working class. Members of this class work long hours and exploit themselves on the job, but the discipline they experience at work is different from the discipline imposed on the working class. There's an upper layer of owners of small to medium-sized businesses that produce commodities. That would include some professionals like doctors, lawyers, accountants who own private practices, small and medium farmers, small landlords who acquire the majority of their income from rent. The lower layer of this class is growing, including more people who work independently, but whose control of the means of production is contingent. That would be small vendors, owner-operators, taxi drivers, bodega owners. The conditions that is the people who are in this layer often resemble the same conditions as working class. And as the promise of economic prosperity fades, a lot of the members of this small capitalist class may be more open to aligning with working class movements. The working class is the largest class. We don't own or control the process of exploitation. To survive, working class are forced to sell their ability to work or to subject themselves to the various methods that the exploiting classes use to extract value. Can somebody help me and read the upper layer section, and somebody prepare to read the middle layer section? Does anybody have it in front of them that could do that?
I can go ahead and read the upper layer. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
So the upper layer of the working class includes software developers, computer programmers, and financial traders who work for employers. This layer includes some occupations which have been displaced from the small-scale capitalist and professional managerial classes, such as doctors who now work for healthcare conglomerates. Although many have retirement savings and own stocks, bonds, and/or mutual funds, members of this layer cannot live off their investments. They could live off their savings for at least 6 months if they needed to. They tend to own property or to be able to afford rent in neighborhoods of their choice. This layer may use debt to finance large purchases, for example, home, car, etc., but debt payments make up a small percentage of their expenses. They are more likely to be white and cis male than the rest of the working class.
Somebody else want to read middle?
I can read it. The middle layer of the working class is more varied, including many but not all workers who are employed in unionized jobs. In spite of the attack on unions over the past 30 years, members of this middle layer generally enjoy a higher level of stability than other members of the working class, though not at the level of the upper layer. Unionized workers in this middle layer range from public sector workers to nurses and some other healthcare workers. Another section of this middle layer includes middle management workers and sales workers. Many in this layer have responded to stagnant wages and to the slashing of the social wage by relying heavily on debt and public services.
Somebody want to do hyper-exploited layer?
I can do it. I can do it. The hyper-exploited layer of the working class draws heavily from what is often referred to as the working poor. One section of this layer is mostly immigrants doing fast food, construction, warehouse, domestic, or farm work. Another section includes people employed in retail and food service. Many of them are underemployed, contracted, casual employees, or working multiple jobs. These are generally understood to be precarious workers. This layer is growing. Members of this layer have little access to debt. What debt they can access is often predatory, and members of this layer also rely heavily on public services and community support networks.
Somebody want to do the excluded layer?
I can read that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I can read it. I just have to get back to it. Sorry. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, I have it in front of me. The excluded layer of the working class has traditionally been referred to as the reserve army of labor. This includes those working people whom the exploiting classes exclude from formal employment in order to discipline employed workers by temporarily calling them into the production process. It also includes the permanently unemployed, and those not counted in the official workforce, i.e. imprisoned people, older laid off people who are not getting rehired, younger people who move in with their parents, and people getting by in the informal economy. This layer will increase significantly if projections about technology and automation permanently replacing millions of jobs over the next 5 to 10 years come to pass. Many in this layer are houseless or precariously housed. This layer constitutes roughly 20% of the US population. Although it is central to the entire class structure of the US right now, precarity is the defining dynamic of the working class, resulting in a general trend of downward mobility. The worry of falling into the ranks of the excluded layer of the working class is growing among members of other classes, especially the small scale capitalist class and other layers of the working class.
Yeah,
Go ahead, sorry.
While class is a way of describing people in terms of their relationship to the process of exploitation, people also inhabit other positions in society that inform their interests, consciousness, and choices. The same person who is a worker in a hyper-exploited layer of the working class is also a woman or an Asian immigrant or LGBTQ or disabled, etc. It's important that we understand these other social factors that influence, but the purpose of this particular section was to try to take another look at what the class structure of the United States looks at today. And not to say that this is correct. I mean, we can all come up with a different idea or a different way to do a class analysis of the United States today. But the key thing about this particular presentation is it focused on how people relate to exploitation, how people relate to debt, how people relate to the different ways, not just on the job ways that people are oppressed and exploited. But I'd like to kind of open it up for some discussion of these different class layers and see what you think. Sometimes what I did a couple of times, we were talking with like some of the bus drivers one time, the Black bus drivers, and they went through the different working class layers to think about where members of their family were on this class analysis. But it was really clear. The other thing we want to do is not fall into the middle class versus the working class kind of construct that people put forward. It's going to be important to reach out to all the different layers of the working class and also to the small capitalist class to build the kind of social block that we're going to need to really implement the kinds of things that we think socialism should be. So we need to understand how to move the various layers to move forward. But I'm good to open up for a discussion, and it's not like I got the answers because we're all learning in this process. And even taking a stab at class analysis is like an experiment. Any comments, discussion?
I can take stack and go through the people asking questions. Claire? You're muted, Claire.
Okay, as you read this, I was looking at my own life to see where I fit in on this. And it immediately became apparent to me to ask you, can someone go back and forth? Because as I was looking, I go back and forth between the small scale capitalist class and the upper layer of the working class. And it's healthcare that keeps me going back and forth between those. But I just wanted to make sure, is that something that is definitely can happen to a person? And do you think that's happening more to people?
Yeah, I would just comment, I think it happens frequently, but generally it's a downward trend for most folks. I mean, particularly folks from the small capitalist to upper layer, like a lot of small capitalists are not able to make it with the pandemic. That really knocked a lot of people out as well. But the other thing interesting in moving, there's some people who are in the excluded class and even the hyper exploited class that kind of try to jump and sometimes make it to the small capitalist class with this whole push around entrepreneurship. Like a lot of unemployed people, they're really, they call themselves entrepreneurs, but they're really unemployed or self-employed. which means they're employed a little bit of time. And I don't know if that's a new phenomenon, but it's really a big push. And it's something we got to be concerned about, because one way capitalism is capturing folks from the working class is selling this whole thing about wealth building and entrepreneurship has to be your goal. And once you buy into that, you kind of buy into the capitalist mode of thinking. So, but people can move from the excluded class to the small capitalist class. But yeah, we move between classes as we move as our life situation changes. Most of us don't jump over to the monopoly capitalist layer.
Dakota.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Dakota. I just wanted to introduce myself really quickly. My name's my pronouns are he, him. I'm a member of the steering committee of Stabilization as well as Socialist Alternative. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about something that Carl kind of brought up briefly, but I think is like pretty important, which is like, the importance of tying other forms of oppression like race, to capitalism. And I have a lot to say. So if I'm going a little long, you can just be like, please shut up, just type it in the chat, because I don't want to take up too much time. But yeah, I think like that connection between racism and capitalism is like really undeniable. Like the capitalist class like clearly recognizes like the threat that like, organized workers play within society. So it's no surprise that one of the fundamental ways that they function is by dividing workers in basically every way possible, because workers exist as a group, living under similar oppressive situations that join them together. Their interests directly contradict that of the capitalist class. Workers are the main power of change to fight against that capitalist system. So when we see, these like major successful movements, whether they be the civil rights movement or labor struggles in early America, it's no surprise that like workers are central to that struggle, and that's why, the capitalist class has to divide them, because they don't want that power to disappear in any way. And, we see this with like the reading mentions, like almost, like dividing workers along like class lines about giving some of them more money than others, or like something like a two-tier wage system within unions that's meant to like destabilize them. And we also see this like with gender, right? And like unpaid labor that women have to do, but also the disconnection from them from like labor struggles. But I think like really in America, one of the biggest, is race, obviously, right? And the division of, Black working class and other ethnic minorities, from the white working class has been destructive, and created massive roadblocks for organizing, mass workers movements. And while millions of brave fighters across the world, have won massive wins against racial oppression, racism is still a very strong, oppressive force in our society. We see that quite clearly in Pittsburgh, whether we look at, a community like East Liberty that's been horribly gentrified, or community like the Hill District, right?
Dakota, I think what you're saying is right on point. There was another section of this same study that went a little bit more in depth into oppressed nationalities, but this section focused mainly just on the class thing. But I did mention that that's not the only thing, and each thing needs, just like the class needs to be dissected and drawn out. The same thing needs to be happen with racial and gender and other forms of oppression. Because the reason for doing this is we need some tools to pull us all together. We got to build this bigger we that can fight for socialism. And how does that work? We have to understand all the different subsets of our folks of the working class and how we pull together. But thanks, Dakota.
Jason, you're next on stack.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I'm trying out a new microphone. Carl and Claire, it was really interesting the interchange before, because I happen to be thinking of something from some research that I used to do that I've been rethinking, and Carl's the reading tonight had me doing some quick reanalysis. The concept of enterprise, quote unquote, right, is often like ensnared with the concept of entrepreneurship. And I wonder if, as democratic socialists and the vision we ascribe to, if it's worth us putting the semantic work in to reclaim the term enterprise, because I can say, especially given this week, we are very enterprising. And I wonder if because when we talk about the small capital, I think of small business. I think about the fact that many people don't haven't thought about like sector unions, haven't thought about how capital as it's currently held by the capitalist and venture capital could be pushed over to the government and socially controlled. So I wonder if there's something on the term enterprise that's worth doing semantic work on broadly in the movement. And Carl, maybe Claire, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important discussion because we really have to understand, we have to win the small capitalists to the side of socialism. And it can be done, but I think part of what you're talking about is part of that. Some other people have used this other term, they're calling it grassroots socialism, in such a way that we describe socialism in such a way that small capitalists can see that it's to their benefit and it's, you know, it's part of what, you know, it's the world they want too. And I think the work that you're talking about is work that needs to be done, because we got to redefine stuff, because, you know, that's part of what this started from, is we couldn't use 20th century socialist kind of concepts as a way to understand our world today, because it's changing so much. But yeah, I think it's really important to reclaim, in a sense, reclaim work. That's what it really comes down to.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. I'm going to say George, and we're closing stack after Zach Michaels. So George, you can go.
Oh, hey, Carl, thanks for this helpful analysis. I just had two questions about it. First, does the monopoly aspect of contemporary capitalism have anything directly to do with the racial aspect? Or is this just, or, you know, racial capitalism, which is now in its monopoly stage? So that's the first question. Is there any direct connection between the monopoly aspect and the racial aspect? And my second question is about the relationship between the PMCs and the upper layer of the working class. You seem to be using PMC in a narrower sense than I've seen it used sort of by other people, generally not Marxists, but anyway. So, you know, you include people like doctors and traders in the upper layers of the working class. And I think some other people might put those in the PMC class. So I take it that for you, the way you're cutting things is always with regard to the process of exploitation, right? So for you, a PMCs are people who help manage the process of exploitation directly or indirectly, right? So like a doctor, for example, couldn't be PMC because he or she doesn't do that. Okay, so those are my two questions.
Yeah. I think the last part is that's the way I understand it, is that, you know, the PMC folks are carrying out the capitalist project directly. They're like the implementers. They're like the technicians and the staff for the capitalists in a sense. Whereas the small scale capitalists are not so much doing that. They're just trying to make their business work for themselves, or you know, keep their 4 units together so they can collect the rent or something like that. And then the upper layer of the working class. I mean, doctors perform a service for people and not necessarily a service for capitalism, although sometimes that can happen. And I think Claire's example was good, where, you know, at one point you could have your own business, but then it becomes hard. So then you end up working for a hospital or a big corporation or something like that. So you can move back and forth. But the PMC class works for the capitalists. They're the ones that create the hegemonic, the hegemony of the system that puts capitalism in all of our brains, is really pushed forward by this PMC class. That's who kind of puts it out. It's the media. It's all these other things that get us thinking in a certain way. And I don't know if I answered your first question. Oh, monopoly, racial monopoly, capitalism. I think the capitalism grew in racial soil. So when I think about racial monopoly capitalism, I'm saying racial stuff happened before capitalism, and capitalism grew out of that racial soil. I don't see how it relates in my mind right now to the monopoly thing as much. Monopoly is just It's just the phase of capitalism we're in, the imperialism and, you know, the development. But a good question.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, and thanks, Carl. I mean, it was really helpful, I think, to have this analysis, especially through a modern lens. At least for me, reading through it, made a lot of sense. I guess my question is as a tool for, you know, education and getting folks on board with, you know, a socialist project. I mean, what are some strategies that you and Left Roots have kind of deployed to actually, you know, educate people on this? And I'm thinking particularly in terms of when we talk about, you know, racial capitalism, when you approach somebody that is, you know, not kind of in our way of thinking, and especially on the topic of race, I feel like the gut reaction is to say, well, I'm not a racist, and the conversation, you know, kind of ends there. Like, what are some strategies to get that person to start thinking about things on a more systemic and historical level that you've, you know, maybe found to be effective?
Yeah, on one hand, Left Roots really hasn't done anything to advance that question. All we've been doing is kind of studying and trying to strategize around the question. But I think the answer to your question is it may not, it's just like the other question around enterprise and entrepreneurship. We don't have to go around talking about racial monopoly capitalism, although that's what we're fighting, and we're clear what we're fighting. But we do need to build a grassroots socialism that understands that the working classes, we're the vast majority. Like when each of us walk around Pittsburgh or wherever we're at tomorrow, almost everybody we see is going to be working class, right? There's not going to be, we're not going to see Jeff Bezos or monopoly capitalists, or we don't run into them. They're just not in our world. And that's what we have to do, is we have to reclaim the class and the majority function of the class. And sometimes words get in the way, like the racial monopoly capitalism may throw people off. So we may have to come up with other words. We may have to figure out different ways. And we may have to pursue multiple strategies together. Like I might be following one strategy, you following another strategy, but it's important that you and I don't fall out with each other because I have a different view. We got to figure out, we're all experimenting, trying to build socialism. We don't know what it's going to look like exactly or how to get there. And we're going to be experimenting, and we got to respect each other as we move forward and test out whatever these different hypotheses are. But yeah, but if words get in the way, we got to change words sometimes. But we can't change the vision of where we're headed. That's really important, and we need to explain that vision to folks, like a vision where everybody has food that they need and a place to live, and you know, everybody. We have the abundance is here, so we can meet the needs of everybody. But we just don't have a system that allows us to do that.
Hey, Jack.
Hey, I also just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jack Taylor, he, him pronouns. This is my first general meeting. I'm excited to be here. I was a member of the United Museum Workers of the Carnegie Museums. That was a really exciting union project, and I'm glad to be here with you guys. So I wanted to touch on some things that Nick said and also some things that Dakota said, and kind of trying to like bridge those two things in my mind. I think like a lot of people, or maybe I just have this perception, think of like leftists as sort of like class reductionists and like ignoring factors like race and gender a lot, and you know, just kind of only talking about like working class and material needs and these things that can be kind of alienating. But I also think that on the flip side, it can be alienating, especially to like white working class or like white working poor folks, when you talk about racism and how it's like capitalism is so entrenched with racism, and then you know, you run into this difficulty, kind of like Nick said, of people not wanting to be labeled a racist or whatever. And so I'm wondering if folks have thoughts about like being conscious of those racial factors that are so ingrained in everything in America, and especially, while also kind of having our message still be very rooted in like material needs as a kind of access point for a bunch of different workers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, part of that I think is we have to recognize that, and down the road, as we have more socialists and more socialist cadre, we may be working in different social sectors of people. So I might be working in Black community, you might be working in a different community, but we can be working on the same project. And I think we're going to have to do some of that. So it doesn't, we don't turn on each other, because that sometimes that can get, we can pit race against class, or pit white against this, or, you know, and it can be damaging. So I think a term that a lot of us use is called, we need to develop emotional intelligence. So we're not like downing each other on the way towards this socialist thing we're trying to create. Because we're, you know, sometimes we get, and this has happened in the past, like I've been around socialist and communist stuff for a while, and we've tore each other up like bad at different periods. And we really have to be careful about that, so we don't become sectarian and just a danger to each other. But I think we can't shy away from the racial and the other stuff. That's the other, there's no way to shy away from it, but I don't think we've got to correct, we don't have the correct frame yet totally, but we got to keep reaching for it.
Finally, Zach M. Then we're gonna close Stack.
Yeah, two quick questions. One is, I guess this is a perpetually kind of provocative question in leftist circles, but where do you think cops are in your analysis? Because I think some people would put them in middle working class, but also if you consider like PMCs to be essentially laying the groundwork for capitalist exploitation, you could almost put police as being sort of like atypically low income PMC, which is just, I don't know, that's
Right.
I'm curious where you feel they are in your model. And then you talked about reaching out to small capitalists. Do you feel like supporting kind of like local business, small business that are tied to marginalized communities is a good strategy for that? So like a lot of people talk about supporting like Black owned businesses. Do you think like as socialists, like we should try to form allies with like petite bourgeois kind of on that basis?
Yeah, two very good questions. I think the thing around the police and the military, we're going to have to try to win some of the military to socialism. So I mean, that's a different question than what our attitude might be towards the police right now. But the reality is some of our family members are in the military and in the police, and either we can work in such a way that if it's necessary, some of them could be neutralized and join the side of socialism. But right now, that's not where we're at. But at different points, we're going to have allies on the inside, and the regular military folks aren't necessarily the managerial class, professional managerial. Like the leadership probably is, but the regular folks that are in there for a check. That we need to figure out a way to reach out. And I know there's differences around the police and stuff like that. I don't see the police as a useful force for us. I think we need to defund the police and come up with new ways to provide safety for folks. On the small business thing, Black capitalism is not a solution. It can't work. It doesn't work. And I mean, right now, what everybody's talking about in the Black community, I don't know if they're talking about it in the white communities as much as wealth building. It's this new term that everybody's kind of talking about, like we're trying to wealth build. And so the non-monopoly capitalist kind of folks are really promoting it with folks that they're going to help you wealth build. Capitalists don't help nobody else wealth build. They build their own wealth. They don't help nobody else get wealth. And it's just it's an ideological kind of incursion into the community. But I'm not saying I buy stuff at Black-owned stores, but there's no principle behind it for me. I mean, I'll support when I can, but that's not it has nothing to do with liberation. It just has to do with where you can shop and you can choose who you want to shop with. I mean, that's my view. I don't think it was a good enough answer for your question, but I think both of those are perpetual questions, and we're going to have to agree on different strategies around the police as well. I think. I know it's hard, but some people say work with the police, or some of the police are your family members, and other of us say the police are pigs and they shouldn't be doing. Both of those things are going to continue to happen as we try to move towards socialism.
I think you did give very good answers. Don't say that you didn't.